Okay, good evening, everybody. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Gary Mond. I'm the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our guest, Brendan O'Neill, and Jonathan Sacerdoti, who's going to be interviewing him. First, I just want to announce that we've decided our next trip to Israel will be in the week beginning Sunday, the 26th of January. So those of you who haven't been on one of our previous trips, I do hope you'll consider coming, and it will certainly be notified to you in our next mailing. So now it gives me very great pleasure to introduce to you our guest speakers, Brendan O'Neill and Jonathan Sacerdoti. Brendan is probably the first time we've ever had anybody who once upon a time was a revolutionary communist, according to his CV. But he's a British pundit and an author. He was the editor of Spiked from 2007 through to September 2021, and is now its chief political writer. He hosts the weekly podcast, The Brendan O'Neill Show, and his writing has appeared in The Spectator, The Sun, and The Australian. His previous collections of essays include A Duty to Offend and Anti-Woke. More recently, Brendan's latest book was released and it's titled After the Pogrom of 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilisation. And Brendan's going to be interviewed by Jonathan Sacerdoti, who's now a well-known British broadcaster and journalist whose incisive commentary spans television, radio, print, digital platforms across the globe. Jonathan has done some interviews for us before, very successfully. His expertise encompasses geopolitics, Middle Eastern affairs, anti-Semitism, and cultural analysis, with an in-depth analysis of British, European, and Israeli politics, alongside his insightful understanding of the British royal family. I now hand over to Jonathan to conduct the interview with Brendan. Jonathan.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And the royal family thing is just that Americans think you're qualified if you speak posh. So anyway, I'm delighted to be doing this again. And I'm even more delighted that it's Brendan that I'm interviewing because I'm a long-term fan of Brendan's work. And Brendan's new book, After the Pogrom, is really, it's a powerful, unflinching examination of modern anti-Semitism and the moral failures that have allowed it to resurface again in our time. And I think that it's the kind of sharp, insightful, unwavering clarity that he brings to that subject in that book that we're used to reading in all of his work, really. I agree with almost everything he writes, and many of you, I'm sure, do as well. So, Brendan, firstly, thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for everything you do.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here talking with you guys. And Jonathan, as you know, I'm a longtime fan of yours as well. Although I am always surprised when I see you talking about the royal family. I think, why is he doing that? But good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So After the Pogrom is, firstly, it's one of those books that I suppose we thought, how on earth did he write that? Because I've seen him everywhere and it just happened. And suddenly we have what is effectively a very deeply considered and well-written book. So congratulations on being the hardest working man out there. And let's talk a little bit about what the book does to start with. And I think, as we mentioned, we'll broaden out into what's going on more recently, even since the book, because the news cycle seems to operate now at like double or triple speed from what we might previously have been used to. So the book, I think, is really interesting because you take what happened on October the 7th, which we're all unfortunately, sadly, too familiar with, but you broaden it out in a really interesting way, and in that you show how the reactions to that really underline the problems that there are in modern society in so many different ways. So could you, just for those who haven't read it yet, and I recommend everyone does, give us a sort of brief overview of what it is you were trying to do with the book?
Yeah, well, exactly that, really. I make clear in the introduction that the book is not about Israel, and it's not really about what happened on 7th of October, although, of course, I mention it, and I mention the barbarism that was visited on Israel by Hamas. It's really about the fallout in the West. It's really about the Western response. And it's really fundamentally about why we failed the moral test of Hamas's pogrom. And I think we did fail it catastrophically. And I think this was a test for the world. It was primarily a vicious, grotesque assault on the Jewish nation, but it was also a moral test for the world. It compelled us to stand up be counted and to offer solidarity to Israel, and we failed. Certain sections of Western society did the opposite. They took the side of Hamas rather than the side of Israel. They cheered the events of 7th of October or made excuses for them rather than condemning them. And they really, I think it was really symbolic of how much we've lost our moral bearings and how much the institutions of the West and the activist class of the West have lost sight of what is civilized and what is right and what is good. So the book is really about teasing out what the response to 7th of October reveals about our own societies and what we might do about some of those problems.
Right, and I think that you have a very good way of I think summing these things up. You've got a very good turn of phrase for them. So some of the things that you've mentioned in the book, I think, are very deserving of a little bit more discussion in this context. So, like, for example, the lure of barbarism and the stands out to me, and this idea also that you talk about of Holocaust envy. These are quite striking terms, but I think they really perfectly sum up some of the problems that maybe some people like yourself have seen coming for years. But on October the 7th, 2023, everybody that used to, I don't know about you, everybody that used to tell me, well, you're a bit over the top, you're a bit mad, you're a bit obsessed with these things, suddenly they all phoned me up and said, oh, you were right. I imagine you've had a fair amount of that. But tell us really what you meant by those sorts of things: Holocaust envy, the lure of barbarism, those sorts of things, and how they manifest in today's society.
Yeah, so the first chapter is called The Lure of Barbarism, and it really is just a reminder of all the crazy things that happened in the West after 7th of October. So I remind people, for example, that there was a gathering outside the Israeli embassy in London on the 9th of October, about 36 hours after the pogrom, when Israel hadn't properly responded to the attack. So this was not an anti-war protest. This was not an anti-Israel protest. In fact, there was pop music. People were dancing in the streets. They were singing. They were waving the Palestine flag. This was a pro-pogrom celebration on the streets of London in 2023. And I make the point in the book that it was as perverse and grotesque as if people in London had poured onto the streets to celebrate Crystal Night. And I also argue that we are starting to forget that these things happened. We are forgetting, I think, that there was a pro-pogrom celebration in London. We're forgetting that people gathered at the Sydney Opera House, also on the 9th of October, to chant F the Jews and to burn the Israeli flag. We're forgetting that across London, almost immediately after the pogrom, people were on the streets and they were openly celebrating Hamas, and they were chanting for the return of Muhammad's army to kill more Jews. So the depravity that our society sank into in the days and weeks after 7th of October was really shocking. And it's the thing that made me want to write the book. I knew the response to 7th of October was going to be bad. I knew people would make apologies for the violence. I knew they would say it was an act of resistance. I knew all that stuff was going to happen, but the response was so much worse than even I had anticipated. And it was those pro-pogrom celebrations that really made me think I've got to start thinking about this very seriously. What does it indicate about our society? And then the thing that compelled me to start getting my thoughts together for a potential book was when there were all those attacks on the kidnapped posters. I think that was a real turning point in Western society, because across the West, in almost every city in Europe and America, wherever these posters were put up, they were torn down, and they were torn down in the most savage, irrational way. You know, I would cycle through London, and everywhere I looked, I would see the flapping remains of one of these posters, and you might just see the eye or the mouth of the person whose face was on that poster. And I just thought, this is a form of hysteria. This is anti-civilizational delirium. This is a madness that needs analysis. And then I'm sure some of the viewers tonight will remember that in Finchley Road, there was a kidnap poster showing the 3-year-old twins who were kidnapped, and someone had daubed Hitler moustaches on them. And it was events like that that made me think, you know, I cycle through Finchley Road quite a lot. I have friends who live there. I go there sometimes. And I thought to myself, okay, I live in a city where there are people who think Jewish children are legitimate targets for racial hatred. I live in a city where people think Jewish kids it's fine to make fun of them. It's fine to call them Nazis. And it really did jolt me into a kind of awakening where I thought, I don't want to live in a city like that. I don't want this to be my reality. And I can only guess how Jewish people feel about living in that kind of city. So it was those kinds of events that made me think, I've got to start writing this down. I've got to start working out what's going on here, because there's been Israelophobia for a long time. And Jonathan, you've been writing about it for a long time. But after 7th of October, it was on steroids, and it really told us something about our own societies.
Yeah, and I think those the hostage posters is a really interesting sort of early sign of that, as you point out, because when you think about the society we live in today, actually, it might have seemed tokenistic or whatever, but those very tokens are actually the holy cows of our era. So, whether it's Black Lives Matter or bring back the girls when the all those schoolgirls were kidnapped, if you dared to challenge in any way any of those social campaigns, people, you would be crucified and cancelled quicker than I don't know what. And yet, when it came to the ones about Jews, Israelis, even, by the way, plenty of non-Jews and non-Israelis who were kidnapped, Thai workers, foreign workers, even from a class perspective, these are immigrants, working class people, Jewish, non-Jewish, Arabs, and as you said, shredded, literally shredded with glee. It was totally clear what people meant by that reaction. I agree with you. And I think that you touch on an interesting idea, which is that this all reflects some of society's weirder aspects these days. So, this idea of a race to the bottom with victimhood, this idea of kind of competitive victimhood, and that's where I think I was going with the mention of Holocaust envy. It's kind of like Europe can never forgive the Jews for the Holocaust, and I think it's proving itself now.
Yeah, so Holocaust envy was probably the hardest chapter to write, because I knew that it was going to be a little bit controversial. So the argument I make in that chapter is that I noticed something really interesting in the week or 2 weeks after 7th of October, which is that newspapers like The Guardian and also Time magazine in America and other kind of centrist liberal outlets, they all started to publish articles saying it's really reckless and irresponsible for Israel to compare Hamas's pogrom to the Nazis. And they said this is unacceptable. It's upping the ante. It's presenting Israel as victims when they're not really victims, and it's exaggerating the threat posed by Hamas, etc., etc. There were all these articles saying, don't do it. Don't make that comparison. These were all published in newspapers and magazines which have spent the past 10 years comparing everything to the 1930s, comparing everything to the Nazis. And I mean almost everything. The vote for Donald Trump in 2016, the vote for Brexit, the rise of populist parties in Europe. The Guardian has published countless articles saying such and such is reminiscent of the 1930s, of the rise of fascism, or, we're going to be headed back to the concentration camps, etc. And I just found it extraordinary that the very people and the very outlets that have spent the past 10 years seeing fascism everywhere failed to see it where it really did appear. They failed to see it in the invasion of Israel and the slaughter of 1,200 mostly Jewish people by an army of anti-Semites. That's the first time they said, oh, no, 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 we can't use the fascism analogy here. It's inappropriate. And so I wrote that chapter to try and explain what was going on there, because I think something really sinister was taking place. It was, I argue that it's worse than Holocaust denial. It's Holocaust theft, because what is essentially happening here is that the Jews' moral ownership of the Holocaust, by which I mean the understanding of humanity, that this was primarily an attempt to destroy the Jewish people, that is increasingly being weakened and called into question. And the Holocaust is now seen as an event which persecuted all sorts of people, not just the Jews. People will emphasize that. Trans people claim to have been victims of the Holocaust, which, by the way, is not true. This very small number of transgender people who were targeted by the Nazis were also homosexuals or Jews, and that was the primary reason they were targeted. So, but there's this desire to claim a piece of the Holocaust, to claim a piece of the action, if you like, because we do live in an era, as you say, of competitive victimhood. And there are many social groups out there who simply cannot abide the fact that the Jews have this claim to the largest act of victimization in human history. And they try and take it away from the Jews. And we saw that with when the Muslim Council of Britain temporarily boycotted Holocaust Memorial Day a few years ago because they said it needs to include Srebrenica and genocides against Muslims and genocides against other people. It can't just be about Jews all the time. They wanted a piece of that victimhood action. And I found it a really grotesque symptom of the era in which we live. And so in that chapter, I just try and tease out the way in which even the Jews' own experience of historic persecution is being stolen from them. The language is being stolen from them and is being weaponized against them. So now the Jews are seen as the people who commit genocides. They're the ones who commit holocausts. They're the ones who carry out pogroms. The settlers in the West Bank are always accused of carrying out pogroms. So the language of the Jews' own historical suffering is now turned against them. And as you say, it really is an effort by Europe, I think, on the intellectual classes in Europe, to absolve themselves of guilt for the greatest crime in history and to project that guilt back onto the Jews. So it's a form of historical vengeance, I think. And we've seen it in the aftermath of the Amsterdam pogrom as well.
Yeah.
Anyone who calls that a pogrom, which in my view is what it was, if you read the details of what was done to people, it's horrific. That anyone who called that a pogrom was denounced as well, because you're not allowed to use that word specifically about Jews. You can use it about other communities, not about Jews. So it's a form of Holocaust theft. And I think it's one of the most sinister developments after 7th of October.
Right, and I think you're spot on in that, because not only do all these people call everything Nazi except for Nazis and everything fascist except for fascists, but the people who are least allowed to do it are actually the Jews, who are the victims of those things. And similarly, as you said, genocide is now this allegation. I mean, I've said I've been booked more times in the last sort of few months to do big events talking about defending against an allegation of genocide than probably the rest of my life. That's because I'm not a genocide expert. But the idea that that's where we've got to in 2024 is quite outrageous, actually. And again, genocide, a word invented by a Jew to describe something that happened to Jews and others throughout history. It's quite extraordinary that this is the one group is not allowed to use that word anymore. And in fact, genocide, the genocide that is connected with October the 7th is what happened on October the 7th. It actually qualifies by all of the sort of qualifying factors, you know, to do with dehumanization, the methods of killing, the aims of what they did are far more matching, I guess you would say, to have it described as genocide than anything Israel is doing in response to that. So I think that's that I actually thought that chapter was a very important one. So I'm pleased that you did put the thought and the care into writing it. And you mentioned Amsterdam. So let's talk a bit about that, because you know all of this is even since your book has been published. And when we spoke earlier today, before this, you mentioned actually in a way that Amsterdam to you felt almost more serious. Can you elaborate a little bit on why that is?
Yeah, I think obviously the Amsterdam event was insignificant in comparison with 7th of October, but the response to it, for some reason, it has chilled me as much as, if not more than, the response to 7th of October. Because, at least with the response to 7th of October, all the Israelophobes and outright anti-Semites, at least they could try and dress it up as a political act. Now, I don't think it was a political act. I completely agree with you. I think it fits the definition of genocidal violence more than anything Israel has ever done. Hamas is a genocidal movement that is devoted to the destruction of the Jewish state and the expulsion of Jews from that part of the world. But at least after 7th of October, these people could pretend in a very unconvincing, thin way that, well, it's resistance. There's been war there for a long time. It's part of that long war. Whereas I think it was a break not only from the conflicts of the past few decades, but also a break from civilization itself, a break from the values of humanity. But they could make those kind of phony claims. They could get their flags out. They could go on the streets. They could pretend to be anti-imperialists, etc., etc. After what happened in Amsterdam, on the other hand, was just undeniably an anti-Semitic attack in every conceivable way. And if you read the details of what was done to some of those victims, some of them were cornered and they were asked, "Are you Jewish? And are you Israeli?" And if they couldn't prove that they were not Israeli, then they were beaten to a pulp. They were kicked in the face. One man had his teeth broken. Another man had black eyes and cuts everywhere. And all these details people will be familiar with. And the response of Western so-called intellectuals has been to make excuses for it and to depict it almost as a kind of either as football hooliganism, which is not true, or to say that the Israelis had it coming. They deserved it because they behaved badly earlier in the day. They deserved it because they made some offensive chants, which, by the way, all football fans do. They deserve it because they were bringing the spirit of fascism to Europe. That's what one person said. So it was such an extraordinary and revealing and quite despairing moment, I thought, because it demonstrated that I don't like to make comparisons with the 1930s unless they're appropriate, but when the middle classes of Europe are contextualizing anti-Jewish violence and making excuses for anti-Jewish violence and saying, well, maybe they had it coming, they're not nice people, that's when we should worry, because that is what happened in the 1930s. There was the Nazi violence that everyone is familiar with, and the pogroms and the boycotts and the expulsions, etc. But there was, more importantly than that, was the shoulder shrugging of the middle classes and the excuse making and the turning of a blind eye and saying, well, what do they expect? If they behave the way they behave, they're going to get it like this. That's what we saw after Amsterdam. The exact same thing coming from the exact same layer of society. So we have a fight on our hands. And when we spoke earlier, Jonathan, we were comparing how despairing we both feel at the moment. And I know that you feel it particularly as a Jewish person. I think there is a lot to be very, very worried about. And working out how to address these problems and potentially to fix them, that's a real challenge that we face.
Well, I mean, it's worth saying because we did discuss that earlier, and you said, I feel it as a Jewish person, and I do. I think it's also a good moment just to say, thank you as a non-Jewish writer and thinker for what you do. And I sort of hate doing that because it seems like it should be irrelevant. I always tell people that I don't have my opinions because I'm Jewish. I might be more aware in this area because of my history and upbringing and what have you, but at the same time, it's a fact that there aren't many people in positions of visibility and influence who actually are doing what is needed. And we often rely on this idea of a silent majority who agree with us. But I think what many of us have struggled with, many Jews have struggled with, especially in the last year or so, is that question of whether actually there is a silent majority, because maybe they're very, very silent. So what I wanted to ask you is, A, do you think that's a fantasy, that there is this silent majority? And B, if there is, how on earth can we get them to be a little bit noisier? Because I think the whole ship is going down, and that's not just for us, the Jews, that's for everybody. If this goes south, it's not going to be fun for non-Jews either.
Exactly right. I think there is a silent majority on lots of these issues, not just the one we're talking about now, but other issues too, where they probably come down on the right side, the good side of various different issues, but they're often silent. But the question I increasingly ask myself is, how much longer are they going to be silent for? That's the question. You can't be silent forever. There comes a moment when you have to say something. I think people have said something about certain issues over the past few years. I think the vote for Trump in America last week. Now, people might like Trump and they might dislike Trump. I think in this case, that's kind of irrelevant. I have countless criticisms of him and some of the opinions he takes, but I still think the vote for him was extraordinarily important because this was a revolt of the silent majority. This was a revolt of the deplorables, as Hillary Clinton referred to them. 72 million people. That is a staggering democratic bloc And many of them were working class, ordinary people of all races, in fact, white, working class, Latino, growing numbers of African Americans, who defied the diktats of the kind of coastal elites and the democratic establishment that thinks it owns those people. And they voted in a different way. They thought for themselves, and they found Trump's message appealing. And part of Trump's message, again, it remains to be seen how much he sticks by it, but part of it was that he would stand with Israel. And that appealed to significant numbers of people in America. You know, I saw this fascinating poll in America a few months back, which looked at people's attitudes towards the Middle East, whether they were likely to be more pro-Israel or more pro-Palestine. And the poll suggested that the more working class a person was, the more likely they were to sympathize with Israel. Whereas the more upper class or upper middle class a person was, the more likely they were to sympathize with Palestine. And if you had a university degree, you were super inclined to sympathize with Palestine because, as we know, universities have become factories of correct think. They are now just machines for churning out people who share all the supposedly correct thoughts of the modern day ruling class. So that was, I think, an indicator that there are many people out there who haven't been brainwashed by the ideologies of the new rulers. They haven't fallen for the guff that comes out of universities and the moral relativism of it all and the identity politics and the Israelophobia. They haven't been sucked in by all of that. They are out there, and every now and then they make their voices heard. But what I want to know is, you know, if something like Amsterdam happens again, if something like that were to happen in London, I mean, it has been happening in London every week for a year, just at a kind of lower level. If something bigger like that were to happen here, would people take to the streets and fight back against it? Would they stand shoulder to shoulder with the Jewish community like they did in Cable Street in the 1930s, which my closing chapter is about Cable Street and whether that could happen again today? I'm not sure it could, but at the same time, I do think there's a decent majority of people out there who watch all of this stuff and they know what's right and they know what's wrong.
I think that's a very good point. And actually, Trump is a really good example, I think, because I remember, I've told this to a few friends. When Trump got shot, it was quite early our time. I remember waking up early in the morning and seeing the news, and I tuned in to watch Sky News of all things, and they cut to the US coverage from some US station, and they were just interviewing, as they do in these things, eyewitnesses, you know, just somebody queued up to get all the eyewitnesses. And I remember thinking, actually, wow, these people are actually really normal, decent Americans. And I felt ashamed that I had allowed the media, the sort of commentariat, to convince me that the only people that go to Trump rallies were kind of redneck moron racists. And when it came to that moment where even the TV channels who wanted us to believe that, well, they had to interview the people there at the last minute with no screening, and there was a doctor and there was regular working people, and I actually just remember thinking, oh wow, they are lying to us. So I think maybe actually the silent majority isn't that silent at all. It's just that the megaphones of society are controlled by that class of people who just don't want us to think that, and they have spoken in the case of that vote, for example. So maybe there is some hope, and as you say, I do wonder, perhaps to ask you, you say what will make people stand up and do Cable Street again. I often wonder that. After the Manchester Arena bombing, for example, I remember, you know, spending time in Manchester immediately in the aftermath, and I saw, again, it's one of these weird things, I think you probably agree, this bizarre response of don't look back in anger, and someone wheels out, you know, John Lennon, Imagine, and we're not allowed to be angry about psychopaths that blew up little girls in a pop concert. We weren't allowed to be angry about a psychopath who turns out to be an Al-Qaeda fan with ricin in his house, who stabbed little girls in a dance party. Maybe nothing's going to wake people up. Do you have faith that these people who do get it are ever going to actually feel motivated enough in today's world where it's just not fashionable to do so? What's going to make them?
Well, that's a good question. And it's interesting you mentioned the Manchester Arena bombing, because that was kind of a turning point event for me in how I approach these issues and how I think about these issues. Because prior to that, prior to 2017, I'd written loads of stuff on terrorism, and I wrote loads of stuff about why Islamist terrorism is a problem. But my focus tended to be on the politics of fear. And my argument was that we shouldn't respond in a fearful way to these acts, and we shouldn't have authoritarian clampdowns or change the rules of society. And I would still say that. I still think it's not useful to respond in a fearful way. The aim of terrorism is to make you fearful. So there's no point playing their game. So I would still make that argument. But after the Manchester Arena bombing, I changed my focus dramatically, because I recognized the same thing as you. I couldn't believe how subdued we were as a country. I was really horrified, actually. And as you say, people were singing "Don't Look Back in Anger." People were laying a flower and then getting on with their life. We were actively discouraged from getting angry. Our emotions were policed, essentially. That came from the establishment, it came from the media. There were continual warnings that if you get too angry about this, or if you blame all Muslims, which, by the way, no one was doing, then you will whip up Islamophobia. The specter of Islamophobia, the specter of the threat of Islamophobia, as they see it, was used to quell public sentiment. It was used to control public feeling. And it really demonstrated the role that the accusation of Islamophobia plays in contemporary society, which is essentially to control the masses, to suppress our dissent, to suppress our questioning, to suppress any criticisms we might have about Islam or certain religious practices or mass immigration or whatever else. Islamophobia is really used to put a lid on all of that. So after Manchester Arena, I wrote a piece saying, where's the anger? Where is the fury that 22 kids, mostly kids, some teenagers, where's the fury that 22 of our fellow citizens have just been killed by a religious hysteric? That seems to me to be the kind of thing we should be pretty angry about. And there was no anger at all. And what I realized around that time is that, in fact, there's a culture of amnesia around these events. We are encouraged to forget them. And I went to a Morrissey concert last year, and Morrissey said to the audience, it was really interesting. He said, why is it that everyone in this audience will know the names Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who killed 6 children in Manchester in the 1960s? But none of you would be able to tell me the name of the Manchester Arena bombing who killed 22 children in Manchester in 2017. There was this sharp intake of breath because everyone in the audience knew he was right. I bet you hardly any of them could name him. His name was Salman Abedi, by the way. But I bet if you went out into the streets tomorrow and asked 100 people, what's the name of the guy who blew up the Manchester Arena? Few of them would be able to tell you, because we're encouraged to forget. How many people remember the Reading terror attack of 2021 when 3 gay men were stabbed to death by a radical Islamist? Not many people remember that. How many people remember the 2016 Brussels bombings, which killed 33 people? That's a lot of people in the capital of the European Union 7 or 8 years ago. Very few people remember, because we're encouraged to forget. And it really came home to me. You will remember, I think it was also 2017, there was those marches, those fascist marches in Charlottesville in America, and one of the fascists drove a car at the left-wing protesters and he killed a woman. One woman was killed by this far-right man who drove a car. About 5 days later, there was the Barcelona ISIS attack, when an ISIS terrorist drove a car down one of the main shopping streets and killed 10 people, including a child. I bet you most people, especially people of a left-wing persuasion, will very well remember the Charlottesville attack that killed 1 person, but they won't remember the Barcelona attack, which was also done with a car that killed 10 people. So our memory is manipulated, our minds are manipulated, and our emotions are manipulated, and we are discouraged from talking about this stuff. It is a very subtle form of censorship. And I think it's really important that we do talk about it and we do say radical Islam is a serious problem. And it's not Islamophobic to talk about it. And it's not Islamophobic to point out that many of the pogromists in Amsterdam were of Arab heritage or were possibly recent immigrants. It's not Islamophobic to say these things. It's actually really important, and I would say quite progressive, to draw to the surface all of these problems that we know are having a terrible impact on Jewish communities and on communities more broadly. So we've just got to start speaking out. And if they accuse us of Islamophobia, we should just laugh at them.
I think that's very true. And I always say, you know, we know what we are and we know what we're not. And I think it's about time that we all were a bit prouder of expressing that, because, you know, the more you say what you think, and people tell you you're a fascist for it, and you know you're not fascist, or the more that people tell you you're a racist, you say, no, I'm really not a racist. And say, oh, that's why you're racist, because you think you're not a racist. It's this kind of doublespeak that is taking over, unfortunately, large parts of the media and parts of academia, and it's all the most influential parts of our lives. So there's a whole generation or two already kind of indoctrinated with this idea, and I think that a lot of your work has very admirably, you know, filleted that ridiculous tendency that's going on. So I hope that, you know, that people can read more and more of what you do if they're not already familiar with it. And I think we're about half an hour in, so I know that Gary said that we would talk for about that long, though I could happily keep going for hours and let everyone else bring in their questions. So thank you for our discussion, and hopefully we'll have even more interesting questions from everybody else.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Brendan. The first question I saw was Barry Epstein. He'll be followed by Irene Lancaster, then Rosalind Pine, then Judy Jackson. Barry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Brendan, that was phenomenal. There are lots of questions I would like to ask you, but if I asked them all, Gary Mond would cut my vocal cords. So I will just ask you one. You're obviously a damn good historian. You're obviously a man who can view things globally. Do you not think that what is happening now in the Middle East is an unraveling story of biblical proportions, and its start was 2,000 years ago with the fact that Jesus Christ was repudiated as King of the Jews? And if you read the first chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, he had a greater claim to the throne than Herod the Tetrarch, who was only married to the granddaughter of the last Maccabean king. That went on to the rise of the prophet in Saudi Arabia, as was his first act, or one of his first acts, being the expulsion of the Jews from Mecca and Medina. And this is a mere playing out of an unraveling story that started 2,000 years ago and is now drawing to a conclusion, in as much as Jewish flesh is no longer cheap.
Thank you, Barry. Brendan.
Well, I'm not a historian, but thank you for saying that. I take that as a compliment. I think something of biblical proportions is happening. I do think that's right, and I think the retargeting of the Jews by, firstly, Islamist armies in the Middle East, and also by, I guess, intellectual armies in the West. I always say there's a pincer movement against the Jewish nation. They're under physical siege by the proxies of Iran and the armies of anti-Semites around there. And they're under intellectual or moral siege by the thinkers of the West. So there's a kind of pincer movement against Israel, which I find deeply concerning. And the Jews are, once again, I think, being singled out and held responsible for the ills of the world. And one of the points I make in my book, one of the last chapters, is on why anti-Zionism is racism. I've had it up to here with the idea that there's a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I can't see any difference anymore at all. And I make the point that all the things that used to be said about the Jewish people are now said about the Jewish nation. So we used to be told that the Jews were uniquely bloodthirsty. They loved to kill Christian children and drain their blood. Now we're told that Israel is a uniquely bloodthirsty nation, that the IDF loves killing children. We used to be told that the Jews were the master manipulators of world affairs. They had their fingers in every pie. Now we're told that Israel has Britain and America eating out of the palm of its hands, and it controls Western politics. You know, we used to be told that the Jews were sneaky, they were a local menace, they were probably responsible for whatever was going wrong in your own community. Now people see Israel in the same way. You know, you will meet young people on some of these protests and on certain campuses who talk about Israel as if it were a direct threat to them. They're scared of Israel. I mean, they have a physical kind of hysterical fear of this one nation. So I'm very interested in how all the historical hatreds of the Jews and all the historical urges to expel them or ghettoize them or get rid of them, they've all been rehabilitated on the back of Israel hate. So that's why I've come to the conclusion, firstly, that yes, history is repeating itself. I think that's right, but in a way that is new and different and difficult for some people to understand, which is that it's all now filtered through this obsessive hatred for the Jewish state. And I think that's the thing we need to tackle primarily, even as we confront, of course, the anti-Semitism in our own societies.
Thanks, Brendan. Irene Lancaster.
Hi.
Can we see
Hi,
you?
can you see me?
Yes,
Hi, both of you. I'm very interested in your talk, Brendan. First of all, I write for a website and I would like to review your book. So maybe Gary could send me your details after this. Secondly, I live in Manchester. Thirdly, I was brought up in Southport. I heard about Southport when I was visiting my family in Israel. And I was really cut to the quick. And it's quite obvious to me, and I have to say this, that there is definitely a two-tier policing and government view of who can be prosecuted, for so-called hatred. The sorts of people that were worried about what was happening in Southport were not allowed to say it. I also started the Jewish History Department at Manchester University. A week or so ago, Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel's head, was cut off the bust, which I don't think has been mentioned. As we know, Justin Welby, thank goodness, has just resigned. He wasn't just a hypocrite over abuse, he was also virulently anti-Semitic, and the chief rabbi of South Africa actually wrote an article about this because our own chief rabbi didn't. The fact is, we now have a chance to stop a very important part of society. I wonder what you think about this. I know very few people are now going to church, but they do sit in the Lords, and they do spew out a lot of hatred against Israel. And Brendan, you're too polite to say this, but our institutions, apart from Gary Mond, are weak and get rid of people like Melanie Phillips, who speak it as it is and speak truth to power. And I do listen to Spiked, and I do listen to Melanie, and I was the first person to review her novel on a website because nobody else would, which was saying, as in a novelistic way, more or less what you've said. So do you think we can take on the present Labour Party, which is woke, and also, the church, which has power far in extent of actually the numbers? Thank you, Brendan.
Brendan.
Oh yeah, get the bishops out of the House of Lords for a start. That would be a start. I don't think there should be any men of the cloth in the law-making institutions. You know, this is not Iran. I don't think we need theocrats overlooking legislation drawn up by elected people. But then I think everyone should be out of the Lords, not just the bishops, but the whole thing. Get rid of the whole chamber. I think on Melanie Phillips, can I just say she's one of my all-time heroes. I love Melanie Phillips. I was absolutely thrilled when she wrote a review of my book. She wrote a very, very positive review of my book, which was thrilling for me because I've been reading her stuff since I was a teenager. So that was a very nice moment. I think you've listed a lot of people there who we need to take on. And I agree with all of them as targets for things that people we need to challenge. The Labour Party, the Church of England, the institutions more broadly. I think a lot of our institutions have fallen for the so-called woke ideology. They've fallen for this kind of post-truth, post-reason way of understanding the world, this very divisive form of identity politics, this loathing for their own nation, this skepticism they have for Britain itself, this view that Britain is a horrible country. Our history is one litany of crimes against humanity. You know, that's how they see the nation. They're very hostile to the country in which they actually live. So our institutions are run by people who don't like us very much and don't like the country very much. So it is important that we have a reckoning with that section of society, and even more so that we put forward preferable, better, ideally more inspiring ideas that can win more people to what we think, which is that people should be treated equally, and we need to call out Islamist terrorism. We need to challenge anti-Semitism. I think we've got to put those ideas back on the agenda, because too often they're not on it.
Thank you, Brendan. Rosalind Pine.
Good evening, Brendan. I've been reading your articles, your insightful articles for many years.
Rosalind?
Yes?
Got a camera? Have you got a camera? We can see.
Do I want to be seen? Not really. I'm
all
quite
right,
happy
then
not
never
to be
mind.
seen.
Don't worry. Carry on.
Several thousand years ago, there was a Roman general called Publius Cyrus, and he came out with an insightful remark. And he said, "Praise your friends in public, admonish them in private." And on that score, I think, how much would you agree that many of our problems are self-inflicted? In other words, for years and years and years, the Jewish press organizations, the Board of Deputies, you name it, it was deemed sophisticated to look at to be critical of ourselves in public, to nitpick, because they mistakenly understood or thought that by trying to show that, you know, we're decent people, we know our faults, that this would be appreciated and reciprocated in kind. But I've watched in many gatherings that exactly the opposite is true. When I used to go to these debates, you know, the anti-Israel crowd, you would see the anti-Israel crowd would never give any concession whatsoever to anything good that Israel did. So my question to you is, as a non-Jew, how much truth do you perceive in that? And I'm sure Gary will know what I'm talking about, as we were fellow deputies who were eased out one way
definitely, or another. Rosalind, definitely.
So I'd like your take on that, please.
Well, I don't want to rain criticism down on Jewish society too much. Firstly, because I'm not a Jew, and secondly, because I don't know the ins and outs of it in detail, although I'd love to hear more about some of these tensions. I know these tensions exist, and I know what you're speaking about. I do think, however, that it is very important at the moment for the Jewish community to be as unified as possible, and not just a kind of happy clappy unity, but a unity forged around a real belief in the right of Jewish people in Britain to live in peace, or Amsterdam or anywhere else in Europe, without being persecuted or attacked by mobs, whether that's mobs of migrants or mobs of left-wingers. So that's an important thing for the Jewish community to be really unified around. I also think there should be at least greater unity around the idea of Zionism itself, and certainly the idea of protecting the Jewish state from the imminent threat it faces from the armies of anti-Semites on its borders. There ought to be greater unity around that. One thing I find concerning is that, you know, when we see left-wingers and intellectuals and others saying, we don't hate Jews, we just hate Zionists, I find that so phony and so unconvincing, because we know who they're talking about when they talk about Zionists. We know that they are talking about the majority of British Jews who do identify as Zionists, or who have a strong identification with Israel. So that's who they're talking about. And I do think instead of critique of how Jewish society organizes itself, probably a preferable thing to do right now in this atmosphere of pogroms and attacks and anti-Israel hysteria, a preferable thing to do would be to have the shield of unity to protect your own community and decency itself from the threat posed by these Israelophobes and anti-Semites here in Britain.
Thank you, Brendan. Judy Jackson. Hi, Judy.
Hi, Brendan. My question to you is fairly short. It is, how scared should we in Britain be? And it's as a result of what happened in Amsterdam, and following that, the Israeli response to their citizens to say, don't go there. Don't go to sporting events. Don't go to events. Don't go where there's going to be a lot of people who recognize you're Jewish or Israeli. And that speaks not just for Amsterdam, but for London, Paris, Brussels, other cities in England. Now, the reason I'm asking this particularly is that, first of all, I'm of an age where my friends very much remember the Holocaust. That's one thing. The other is that of our 4 sons, one of them lives in America and is in a very serious state of worry about what's happened there. Another one lives in Israel and has been very, very close to 2 awful things, one in Herzliya and one in Ra'anana. And the third one lives in London, and the 4th one lives in New York. And so what I'm asking you now is, how frightened should we be, having been told by ourselves, by the Israelis, don't go there? I mean, before it was always the authorities who said, you Jews can't go there. But now we're telling ourselves we can't. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think my guess is probably you should be quite frightened, because very bad things are happening in Europe and elsewhere and in the United States. But I think the fright and the fear has to be balanced with a serious commitment to doing something about these problems. And that's what I think is so important about precisely discussions like these and other discussions that have taken place over the past year in particular. I think it is right for people to feel exceptionally worried about what's happening in Europe. You know, I really hate to, as I said earlier, I hate to make 1930s comparisons unless they're appropriate. And I do feel when I see things like the Amsterdam pogrom, or I look at the various attacks on synagogues and Jewish institutions that have taken place in Britain and France and Belgium and other countries over the past year, I have found myself thinking, oh, okay, this is how Nazism can happen. Because not only are there hateful people around attacking Jews and attacking Jewish institutions, but more importantly than that, there are huge layers of intellectual society or middle-class society who are looking the other way, or who are justifying it, making excuses for it. And we saw that after the events in Amsterdam. We saw lots of people in Britain and other European countries, influential people who are fated by the BBC and who write for newspapers, saying, well, they had it coming. What do they expect? They're thugs. They're fascists. They got a good kicking. Ha, 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 essentially. So you start to understand how something like fascism can take hold in a society, because it takes 2 things, really. It takes the existence of a fascistic threat and the willingness of influential people to look the other way. And I think we have those 2 things at the moment. It's very early, and I don't think we're turning the corner to anything like the 1930s at the moment. But I do think the fear and concern that lots of Jewish people have, if we balance that with a renewed commitment to speaking up as loudly as possible for the right of Israel to exist and the right of Jews to stay in Europe, then I think we'll probably be on a better footing to challenge some of this hysteria that is sweeping through our society.
Thank you, Brendan. Michael Goldberg.
Hi, Brendan. It's great to have the opportunity to talk to you in this forum. My wife and I are both Spike subscribers, and we're both reading your book at the moment, which is most excellent. My question, and I'll try and keep it short. I know you're a free speech absolutist, or as near as it can be. We always have kicked around ideas theoretically about Israel and anti-Semitism to stress test our free speech ideas. And obviously in the last year, that's no longer been hypothetical. And I guess we all have our break point. For me, when I saw From the River to the Sea projected on Big Ben, I felt, no, there has to be a limit. And maybe that's where you find your level. I just wondered, do you have any tips on how those of us who don't want things banned, who don't want people taken off the street and locked up, as we've seen happening a lot this summer, how do we navigate this and still stay true to our free speech credentials?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I mean, I guess I would differ from you in relation to that slogan being projected onto Big Ben. I hate that slogan. I think it's a genocidal slogan. I think it is clearly it clearly expresses a desire to destroy the Jewish state. But such is my commitment to freedom of speech that I would still defend people's right to chant it and to project it. And I think probably the best way to counter it you know, if we had more resources, people who on our side of this argument, if we had more resources and more time and more energy and more money, we could have gone down to Big Ben the very next day and projected a pro-Israel slogan. You know, so I always think that's a better response to hateful speech, is to counter it with more enlightened speech. I do think it's always worth bearing in mind how censorship can backfire. And you know, the classic example, and it's also a true example, is that the Nazi Party in Germany, before they came to power, in the Weimar Republic, they were often subjected to censorship. Their newspapers were sometimes censored, and their politicians were sometimes censored, and they were censored on the basis that they were saying hateful things. They were saying anti-Semitic things, and they were sometimes taken to court, they were fined. And it kind of backfired because they were then able to present themselves as victims. They were then able to say, see, you know, the state's out to get us. We're an oppressed minority. You've got to come onto our side. We've got to fight back against this tyranny. And lots of people heeded that call, in fact. They could present themselves as an oppressed minority. I just think in all those situations, it is so much better to combat hateful ideas with better ideas. Because as soon as we trust officialdom or the moral majority to dictate what ideas are acceptable and what are not acceptable, it's only a matter of time before they turn that judgment on us, and before they, you know, the wind will blow in the opposite direction, and suddenly you won't be allowed to go on the streets and say, "Long live Israel" or something. So I do always err on the side of freedom of speech, even though I know it causes a lot of tensions and problems because there are a lot of hateful ideas out there. But I think it's always preferable to censorship.
Thank you, Brendan. Naomi Stanley. Naomi, you're on mute. Naomi, hello? Please. Ah, there you go.
Okay, sorry, I thought you had to unmute me or something, but I had the power myself. Yeah, just earlier on, Judy was saying, that lady called Judy was saying, how do we all feel? You know, how frightened should we be? I just wanted to say that I don't know whether you've been following the news today, but the Amsterdam stuff has continued, and they've been burning big mobs have been burning trains. And in fact, one of them, they set fire to a tram screen, and they were chanting "Cancer Jews, cancer Jews." So it's continuing. It's not up. We were talking about it in the past tense, but it's not past. It's current. And that the Israeli Ministry of Diaspora Affairs has issued a threat assessment for Jews in Europe, identifying 5 countries with a high or very high risk of physical assault, and on the top 2 are the UK and France. So I just wanted to say that one of the things that affects me is that I've noticed is that most people who identify with being Jewish tend to live in what's called the Jewish communities, like North London, some in Leeds, Manchester. There are still, you know, Jewish areas, if you like. And I don't live in a Jewish area. I live in South London, and it is very different. When I go to visit a Jewish community, I can walk around and see people looking visibly Jewish. You can't do that where I live. You can't do that safely. You know, you might get away with it, but if you live here, you don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be identified. So it is very different. Now, I think it's really, I've always followed you for a long time, and I think it's really interesting because you come from the far left, and I don't know how you identify yourself now in terms of left, right, or if you do at all, because obviously you have moved significantly to how you were many years ago. So have lots of people. I was on the left. But I just wondered how you see, because you're saying positive things, which of course we have to, about what to do. But we have a Labour Party with a huge number of MPs for the next few years, and our institutions and organisations and the police have got have got significant people in power who are rolling out this anti-Semitic stuff and not defending us, and obviously not on our side, and in many cases actually supporting the Palestine law. So how positive or negative, how do you feel about the next few years, the likelihood of us being able to do anything when we've got a Labour government in power?
Brendan.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't describe myself as positive as such. I'm depressed sometimes about the way things are going, especially about the Labour government.
You're falling asleep. Hello. Don't
Sorry,
fall asleep.
people on mute, please.
Falling asleep. Do you want to go to bed?
Yeah. Sorry.
Falling asleep, man.
Can we mute Rosalind? Thank you.
Sorry, I did.
Rosalind, thank you. Okay, carry on. Carry on, Brendan.
Yeah, sometimes I feel quite depressed about what's happening, especially with the Labour government, which is, I think, the worst government of my lifetime. They're so useless. Their first 100 days was just disastrous, and they're just rubbish at everything. So I do feel quite despairing about where politics is going. And I have just written a book where the subtitle contains the words Crisis of Civilization. So I do think there is a crisis of civilization. And it's a very profound one. And we see it in universities, we see it in the media establishment, we see it in popular culture, where people are embracing what I would consider to be the ideas of barbarism and very regressive ways of thinking. And there's one chapter in my book on the Islamo left, which is the alliance that the left has suicidally made with radical Islam. So, you know, you have groups like Queers for Palestine, beautifully unaware that if they ever went to Gaza, they would be thrown off the top of a building. You know, these are deranged times. Lots of mad things are happening. And so I definitely don't want to give the impression that we have an easy ride or that things are going to get better anytime soon. I think they'll get worse before they get better. I think in relation to, you know, what people can do more broadly, I mean, the thing is, after 7th of October, I just found myself getting irrationally angry. I remember every time I cycled past an anti-Israel demo, whether it was a big one or a small one, I cycle around London all the time. And whenever I passed one, I would just scream out, F Hamas, although I would use the real words, because I was so ticked off with everything that was happening. And it was this quite futile gesture, but it did make me feel good for about 5 seconds. And I found myself doing things like that and just getting increasingly irate. And then I started talking to Jewish groups, and I was invited to talk at some synagogues, and I made lots of new friends, and I met people I'd never met before, and I engaged with lots of people in Jewish organizations who were inviting me to speak, and I was thrilled to be invited to speak tonight. And that did make me think, oh, okay, there is a groundswell of reason out there. There's a groundswell of good people, decent people, concerned people, Jewish people and non-Jewish people. So they are out there. But as Jonathan was saying earlier, at the moment, a lot of them are quite quiet. They either don't want to speak up or they're fearful of speaking up, but they are out there. So I guess if I were to sound an optimistic note, it would be to say that I think the establishment has gone mad and they are a lost cause. And the sooner we get a new one, the better. But at the same time, I think there's loads of quite reasoned people out there who still appreciate the ideals of equality and truth and not beating people up just because they come from a Jewish background. Those people are out there, coaxing them into the public arena and coaxing them to use their voices and maybe even to use their physical weight if push comes to shove. That's going to be the challenge. But I think it's something we can do over time.
Thank you. Richard Cafton.
Hi, good evening. I hope you can see me.
Yeah, we can see and hear you.
Thank you. Brendan, thanks for a very good discussion and explanation. If you look at, moving on from Judy Jackson's question earlier, if you look at the demographics in this country, the Jewish population is about 300,000. The official Muslim population is 4 million. And it's increasing exponentially compared to the Jewish population. With everything else that's going on at the moment and the pervasive anti-Semitism that is clearly coming from a particular section of the Muslim Jewish community, Do the Jews have a future in this country?
Thank you, Brendan.
Yes, I think absolutely they do. I think I remember there was a clip once of Boris Johnson when he was campaigning in December 2019, and he went to Golders Green and he was courting the Jewish vote because obviously no one wanted to vote for that psychopath Jeremy Corbyn. And a group of young Jewish men said to him, if Corbyn wins, we're going to leave the country. And Boris Johnson said, please don't do that. We need you here. And I feel similarly, of course. So I think absolutely the Jews have a future in Britain. But as I was saying earlier, things are difficult. And one reason things are difficult is because I think there are sections of the Muslim community, and this is not all the Muslim community by any stretch of the imagination, but there are sections of the Muslim community who have anti-Semitic views, who are more likely than other sections of society to hold anti-Semitic views. It's not Islamophobic to point that out, because if we say it is, then we're essentially saying it's Islamophobic to talk about anti-Semitism. It's racist to talk about the racism Jewish people feel. And that's a preposterous thing, which some people actually do say because they are preposterous people. It's not Islamophobic to point this out. It's necessary. And when Kemi Badenoch recently said that some recent Muslim migrants to Britain and Europe hate the state of Israel and hate Jewish people, and we don't want those views in our country, I agreed with her. I think it is legitimate for a nation state to say, well, I'm sorry, if you hate this one nation above all others, and if you hate the Jewish people, you are not welcome in this country. So get the hell out. And I actually think that after the Amsterdam pogrom, if any of the assailants were recent migrants, I think they should be deported. There needs to be zero tolerance for fascist violence in 21st century Europe. We have to be very serious about that. But someone was asking earlier, and you just reminded me, someone was asking earlier about two-tier policing, two-tier justice. That's another problem in relation to all of this, because I'm sure some of you remember that in January earlier this year, a man with a knife went into a kosher store in Golders Green, and he waved the knife at the Jewish people inside, and he said, tell me your views on Israel and Palestine, tell me, and et cetera, et cetera. That man didn't spend 1 minute in jail. He got a suspended sentence. He's out on the streets. Fast forward to the aftermath of the riots, the Southport riots, and a 53-year-old woman who is the sole carer for her disabled husband, who's never bothered the law before, was sentenced to 15 months in prison for writing something obnoxious on Facebook. So it is a problem when we live in a society where the police don't take anti-Semitism seriously. We've seen police officers telling visible Jews to move away from pro-Palestine demos. It's a problem that we live in a society with a two-tier justice system. And it's a problem that we live under a Labour government that doesn't understand the problems Britain is facing, far less have any solutions for fixing them. So these are all big, serious, profound problems. But I think avoiding them or running away from them or thinking that they will, or even alternatively thinking they will fix themselves, all of those I think are wrong approaches to it. And it really is only through the hard work of confronting this crap, if you'll excuse my language, that will be able to do something about it.
Thank you, Brendan. Abigail Sensi Di Bello, if I pronounced your name properly. Abigail.
Hi, thanks, Gary. Hello, Brendan. Can everyone hear me? Yep.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the very interesting talk. Really appreciated it. Yeah, I just really want to voice kind of the frustration of, I think, of the Jewish community and anyone that does support Israel, just how powerless I think we feel against the strength of this propaganda, anti-Israel propaganda. And when you kind of talk about kind of challenging, I suppose, those arguments. So ever since 7th of October, I'm not a very politicized person, but I've basically opened a new Twitter account and been, posting things. I have also been attending many of the counter protests as well. And I'm not sure if it's very effective against all that noise that is coming the other way. And I've got a couple of questions. I wanted to know, what do you think is really the most effective thing that people that have kind of woken up from this slumber that they can actually do against all this noise? And whoops, there's a lot of noise in the background there. But the other thing I wanted to mention is I just feel I portion quite a lot of the blame about the rising anti-Semitism really with the media. I think there's so many counter protests. We don't have the numbers, and there's so much tweeting we can do. And I wanted to ask you, Brendan, what you think is the problem there. Why are so many of these honest conversations only condemned to places like Talk TV or GB News? Why is it that mainstream channels are shying away from having an honest discussion, hearing voices like yours on TV, as you know, to counter, I think, some of the left-leaning views? I mean, do you think that the media is institutionally anti-Semitic? Why do you think it's gone down that way?
Brendan.
Yes, I think some of the media is. And I think, for example, the BBC's obsession with Israel and its depiction of Israel is, I think, often crosses the line into something anti-Semitic. I think the same is true of The Guardian. I think these are outlets that they're going along with the dinner party bigotry of our time. And one of the key dinner party bigotries of our time is that Israel is the most evil nation in the world, and anyone who supports it is a bigot or is a problem or is fascistic, whatever they might say. So the BBC and The Guardian in particular go along with that way of thinking, and it's reflected in their coverage, and their coverage is biased and prejudiced and sometimes, I would say, racist. So that's definitely true, and that's a huge problem. I think the media poses a huge problem right now. I think the counter protests, I think, are great. I'm kind of kicking myself because I haven't been able to get to as many as I would like to have because I've been out of the country such a lot this year. But I think the counter protests are brilliant. I love the fact that these puffed up, horrible pricks, I'm sorry, it's getting late. I tend to swear the later it gets. These puffed up so-called pro-Palestine idiots, I think it's great that they can no longer gather on the streets without a noisy counter-protests telling them that Hamas are terrorists and telling them that there's no genocide in the Middle East. They're lying. I think that's actually a really important form of confrontation. And the numbers on the counter-protests might be smaller, but the passion, I think, and the upbeat nature of them and the confrontational nature of them, I think, sends an incredibly important message. So I do think that's a good thing to do. The media is a harder nut to crack because the mainstream media is a lost institution. I think one of the most interesting developments in America with the election of Donald Trump, whatever one might think of Donald Trump, etc., is that he did successfully circumvent the mainstream media, and he went directly to the podcasts and Joe Rogan and the alternative media. He went directly to the new forms of media to speak to new audiences. So I think that probably, even though it hasn't filtered through yet, I think that probably represents a bit of a turning point in the cultural imperialism of the media establishment. I think they probably recognize that their cultural power is being weakened in various different ways through the rise of new media outlets and other forums for discussion. So over the next few years, I think we'll see the media's stranglehold on morality being challenged more and more, which will be a good thing. But in the meantime, I just think pushing back against it, ridiculing it, taking to the internet to challenge what the BBC says and what the Guardian says, all of that stuff is so important. Even if it feels like you're one small person chipping away at a huge monolith, it's still important to do that.
Thank you. I'm going to try and get through as many of the remaining questions as I can. We need to finish sort of around 8:30. Les Bloom.
Oh, hello, Brendan. Yeah, very interesting talk. Thanks very much for giving up your time today. I'm really building up on what your previous speaker, Abigail, just said just now, and you've partly answered it. But my question is, how do we the people viewing this Zoom event, influence people in the UK today? I mean, what can we do? I know you've talked about the silent majority, and that is true. But how do we influence the silent majority, and in people that also the people that are in the don't know, they read on the news and they have no real opinion one way or the other, but they're probably being swayed by the bias of the BBC, etc., etc., and the other stuff, and probably people to meet at work. But how do we influence them, and not only influence them, the people in the middle, but more concerning is the people like that lady who you were alluding to it earlier, tearing down the posters, and you could see by her body language that she was angry. I mean, how do we win her over and educate her to what is right and fair and proper? That's my question.
Oh, you'll never win her over. I mean, I think the important first step is to recognize who is a lost cause and who is maybe not a lost cause, because I'm a free speech fanatic. I believe very much in the power of ideas and the power of the free exchange of ideas. That's an argument I've held for a long time. But that doesn't mean I think everyone can be convinced. That doesn't mean I think if I went in a head-to-head with, I don't know, Owen Jones, for example, that I would successfully change his mind, because I think he's gone too far down the rabbit hole of obsessive hatred for Israel. So I think probably the first step in trying to change how people think is to recognize who's a lost cause. And there are quite a few of them out there. So when that Gaza encampment was happening at Columbia University, for example, where those kids went crazy, it was like they were under the spell of hysteria. They were referring to Israel as the pigs of the earth. They were telling Jewish students to go back to Poland, which, by the way, is incredibly racist. It's like when the fascists in the 70s used to tell black people to go back to Africa. They were, burning the Israel flag, and they were interrupting the first year commemoration for 7th of October. They behaved like crazy, crazy people. I think if you had gone down there, or if one had gone down there to try and convince those kids, it would have been a complete waste of time. It would have been completely futile, because they are behaving like members of a cult. So I think we've got to recognize that some people, for now anyway, are not worth engaging with, while at the same time recognizing that there are many more people who are. And that does include, and I know it can sometimes sound trivial, but it does include what you mentioned, which is discussions in the workplace. It also includes social media activity, which is one of the key ways of getting to people's minds and having discussions and changing how people think. It does mean media work that I do and other people do, and that's very important too. And it just means taking every opportunity to get up on your soapbox, whether literally or metaphorically, and to say, those people are lying. There is no genocide in Gaza. The genocidal movement is not Israel, it's Hamas. Israel is not a uniquely barbarous state. It's a lie. I think it's worth, in every opportunity one gets, it's worth puncturing these lies and myths, because maybe 3 people or 300 people will hear you and start to think a little bit differently. And bit by bit, you can chip away at this kind of lazy consensus of the elites and this kind of silence of the majority, chip away at all of that and start to open people's eyes to a different way of seeing it.
Thank you, Brendan. Alex Friend.
Hi. Thanks, Brendan, for all you do for Jews and Israel. I'm a member of Spike. My question is, what's your take on Tommy Robinson? He's in jail at the moment for contempt of court. I've been following him for some years, and I see him as a great friend of Jews and Israel. I don't align with all of his rhetoric, but I've been on 3 of his rallies in the last couple of months. They were all extremely peaceful. I was there with my Israeli flag and British flag. I was wondering what you think about him.
I'm not a fan of Tommy Robinson. I am concerned about his imprisonment. I do think this is a form of political persecution that's dressed up as a kind of contempt of court or terror legislation case, but I do think it's a form of political persecution. He's been put away because influential people just don't like him. But I don't subscribe to his way of thinking. I don't subscribe to his ideology. And one of the concerns I have with someone like Tommy Robinson is that I think we need to have complete freedom to discuss problems to do with radical Islam, problems to do with the threat posed by Islamist terrorism. It's always worth reminding, because officialdom in this country will often say the far right is a greater threat than radical Islamists, and it's just not true. Almost 100 people have been killed by radical Islamists in this country over the past 20 years. I think the corresponding number is 3 people, maybe 4, killed by far right terrorists. So it's not comparable. We should be free to talk about that. We should be free to talk about problems to do with the grooming gangs. Absolutely. I think the way in which that was brushed under the carpet was unforgivable. The safety and dignity of white working class girls was basically sacrificed at the altar of political correctness. So I think we should be free to talk about all of these things. But I think the Tommy Robinson movement tips over the edge, in my view, from openly talking about these problems that exist in certain sections of society towards depicting Muslims more broadly as a threat to Britain. And that's something I do not agree with and I don't accept. And I think it mimics in some ways what the left says about Jews, or what the radical left says about Jews, which is that they are a pox on this country. They're a fascist influence on this country. And the mimicking of that on sections of the hard right or the extreme right, or whatever we want to call it, I think that's a real problem. And what I want to do is slice through all of this with what I would consider to be better, more progressive arguments, even though I know the word progressive doesn't mean what it used to mean, and make the case for a reasoned, fair, equal society in which everyone is free to call out regressive, violent trends, and everyone is expected to subscribe to moral norms and law and order. And that's the kind of argument I want to make.
Brendan, are you happy to carry on till 9:15?
Yep.
You are. Okay. If you haven't already put your hand up for a question, please don't, because we'll just about have enough time to get through the remaining 8 people who've got their hands up. Teresa, you're next. Teresa, you're on mute, Teresa.
Yeah, I've unmuted myself.
Good.
I spent a couple of not very pleasant hours today online listening to Francesca Albanese. The venue at QM was booked out, so they put on a Zoom. As well as being unpleasant, it was actually quite scary. In many ways, she seems like an upmarket Owen Jones without the patiently dripping hatred, but in fact, soft voice, smiley. But there's probably a dissertation in cataloguing her inversions and distortions. Interestingly, the event was sponsored by about 10 different departments, including the likes of environmental crime, sustainability, and so on. And I would recommend, if it's uploaded to QM's Law Department website, that people listen to it, because she was outlining a multi-pronged strategy. And I think, unless, I don't know if you agree or disagree, unless we have a multi-pronged approach, I don't see how Israel and Jews are going to win out. So that's one point I wanted to make. Something that hasn't been mentioned is the young. Islamists have been spoken of as a problem, but it seems to me, and from surveys and so on, that there's a high density of anti-Semitism and Israelophobia amongst the young. Who is addressing that? There are a few people I've seen, like Kaya Willis, who I find a very interesting person, who went from being woke and anti-Israel to being completely the opposite, just, because of a chance event. And before 7/10, there were some young Jewish people saying we need to make Zionism sexy. Perhaps that's not quite the right word, but there were some young people who were saying, move over oldies, we need to deal with this. And I don't agree with that. I think it should be concerted across all generations. But it seems to me an approach towards the young is missing. One final quick point. Vasily Grossman said anti-Semitism is a means, not an end. I think if we look at it that way, I'm inclined to agree with him. Perhaps he'll throw some light on what has happened and will happen.
Thank you. Brendan.
Yeah, well, Francesca Albanese, the less said about her, the better. From my view, I can't believe the UN has people like this. Well, I suppose I can actually, but it is an indictment of that institution. I think she spouts hateful nonsense about Israel, and no one should take her seriously. Although you're right, people should look at what she's saying in order that we know the poisonous nature of these ideas and how we might counter them. I think that is important. I really agree about the young. I mentioned that in my book. I talk about the polls that came out, the surveys that were done in the aftermath of 7th of October. And amongst younger people in particular, there was a real warmth for Hamas and a real hatred for Israel. And in fact, a survey in America and also a survey in Britain found that huge numbers of young people believe that the Jewish state should be brought to an end and the territory should be handed to Hamas. So in other words, genocidal ethnic cleansing. This is what young people, significant numbers of young people actually believe. So I really think the young people issue is something worth talking about. And in my book, I try to explain why I think that's happened. And I look at, when you have a university system and an education system and popular culture that is constantly beating up the West and saying the West is horrible and Britain is a racist country and America is a racist hellhole, and talking about colonialism and slavery and so on. When you drive the young away from the values of Western civilization, you push them, I think, into the arms of barbarism. So I do think that the youthful sympathy for Hamas is probably an outgrowth of their turn against Western civilization, or our generation's failure to educate them about the virtues of Western civilization. So that's where the crisis of civilization that I refer to is most apparent in young people and their embrace of Hamas.
Thank you. Paul or Ruth Hart?
It's Paul, Gary. Brendan, listening to what you were saying earlier, where do you draw the line on free speech?
I draw the line at incitement to violence. So if someone is using speech in order to directly coax another person to commit an act of violence, then I think that is not free speech. That is the use of words in the commission of a crime. So that's where I would draw the line. But aside from that, I really am a free-for-all person. I really do think it's important to allow freedom of speech in every context. And I would include hate speech in that, because I think the important thing to always remember is that the category of hate speech is being expanded all the time. So hate speech no longer just refers to anti-Semitic speech or Holocaust denial or racist speech. Those were the categories that were typically under the banner of hate speech. It now includes so-called Islamophobia, which can just be criticism of the Quran or saying Muhammad had some ridiculous ideas or whatever else it might be. Blasphemy, essentially. Transphobia, which can just be the expression of a biological fact, or an argument that biological males shouldn't be allowed into women's toilets. That now can be interpreted as transphobic speech. And even talking about anti-Semitism, even talking about the pogrom in Amsterdam, that can be twisted into a form of hate speech, because it is presumed that you are criticizing Muslims for being intolerant, you're criticizing Muslims for being anti-Semitic, therefore you're being Islamophobic, therefore you're being hateful. So it's important, I think, to challenge all forms of censorship, because it's such an ever-expanding category. And I guarantee you that ideas you want to express and ideas I want to express could already be encapsulated under the banner of hate speech, and could already potentially see you being blacklisted from a university campus or shunted off the BBC or whatever else it might be. So always better to have as few lines as possible when it comes to freedom of speech, and to defend the right of all people to express themselves without inciting violence.
Does that include from the river to the sea?
Yes, I would defend people's right to use that horrible phrase. Yeah.
Sam, thanks, Paul. Sammy Steen. Sammy Steen, you're on mute. Okay, you're not there. Mike Benson. Mike Benson. Could you come off mute, Mike, please? Please come off mute. Ah, yeah. Okay, you obviously
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Okay, good. Right, Mike, your question.
Hi, thank you. Hey, Brendan.
Hey.
You've gone back on mute. If you get yourself sorted out, Mike, I'm going to come to Martin Rankoff now. Martin, can you come off mute, please?
I certainly can, Gary, but I can't get my camera on, unfortunately. Thank you. Thank you, Brendan, for all you say and all you do for the community and for Israel. It's appreciated by us all. In your book, you mentioned Cable Street, and you said earlier about the silent majority, should it come to that, would speak up. I mean, did the silent majority speak up in Germany in 1930s? I'm not sure. Everyone on here is engaged, and that's why they're here and they're listening to you and they're taking part. A lady earlier mentioned about the radicalized youth on the left and in the Muslim community. Our problem is that our youth have just spent God knows how many years cowering on universities, campuses that are funded by Qatar and God knows who. And they're just not interested because they've just spent 3 or 4 years hiding away from anti-Semitism, anti-Israel comments. And we need that youth. We need that youth. You might have gathered by looking at the screens that we're not all as young as we like to think we are. So we need that youth to come out on the street with us and do those things that you said. Get on our soapboxes and not virtual ones. Get on our soapboxes and confront these people. I mean, there's a young lady who's very involved who I say a young lady, she's the same age as us, but she's getting people out there every week counter protesting these people and does a marvelous job doing that. But there's Christian organisations joining her, which is fantastic. You know, it's just absolutely marvellous, and they're turning out more numbers than us. But even so, our numbers are low, primarily because there's a lack of engagement, and also because they always do their protests on a Saturday, so they know that the religious element of our community is not going to turn up then. But we can't get the youth out there because they haven't seen that it's a battle or a war that they want to get involved in. It's nothing to do with them. They've got through uni thanks to Tony Blair making everyone go to university. And they've come out conditioned. They've come out conditioned. Keep your head down. Keep your head down. We need that youth out there. How do we engage them?
Brendan.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, about 10 years ago, I was doing a debate at one of the big synagogues in London. I can't remember which one now. And it was me and Douglas Murray and a few others on a panel. And we were talking about what could be done about terrorism and jihadism and the threat posed to Jewish communities. So, you know, all of us have been having these discussions for a long time. And a young Jewish person in the audience asked me what he and his friends could do. And I said, well, you need to get to the gym and work out and be prepared to fight. And it caused a little bit of a storm. There was a report in the Jewish Chronicle, you know, journalist encourages young Jews to fight back, etc. And people thought it was hyperbole, but I was being deadly serious. I was being completely and utterly serious that I do think we need, and I know there are great organizations that provide security to Jewish communities and Jewish events, but I do think we need larger numbers of young Jewish people just, you know, doing some bench presses, getting fit and being ready to organize themselves to fight back in defense of their communities, their ideas, their friends, their people, etc. So we do need much more of that kind of activity. I think it has come to that. You know, we need the shock troops of decency to push back against the shock troops of hatred and the Jew hunts that we've seen in Europe over the past few days. So we need more of that. I think just on the university thing, very briefly, life is pretty awful for not all Jewish students on university. I don't want to be fatalistic or apocalyptic about it, but for some Jewish students, it's pretty bad. especially those who want to be involved in the Jewish society, or they want to invite speakers from Israel or someone from the Israeli embassy. Those kids get a hard time. They are bullied, they're attacked, their events are invaded and disrupted, and they have people throw things through the window. I mean, really rough stuff has happened. So it is difficult for them, I think, in comparison with all other ethnic groups on campus who are afforded all the protections of political correctness, whereas Jewish students are not. So it is difficult, but I think the only way to push back against it is not to be cowed, not to buy into the politics of victimhood, but instead to toughen up and fight back. And I think at some point we're going to need to see that.
Mike Benson, you're off mute now. Mike.
Thank you. I can't believe how long it took me to sort it out. I'm on my phone. Hi, Brendan. Thank you so much for speaking today, and thanks everyone for.
Sorry, you've gone back on mute again, Mike. Sorry, something's gone odd there.
Oh,
sorry.
Am I off?
That's better.
Okay.
Don't
Brilliant.
touch anything else. Just
I'm not touching anything. I'm not touching anything. Sorry, folks. Brendan, thank you so much for your incredible support of the Jewish people. Your brilliant, insightful posts. I follow you on Instagram, repost pretty much everything that you write. I heard, I didn't know this man, Ed Hussein, before, but I heard him talking on a podcast about how in every synagogue in Britain and every church in Britain, we have a prayer for the royal family. And we stand up and praise our country. And he was suggesting that would be a helpful start if every mosque in the country followed suit and did the same. How do we get the moderate Muslims to speak up against the extremists when they're so terrifying? And how do you think, as an incredible ally to the Jewish people, how do you think we can recruit more allies, institutional and individual?
Yeah, so, well, on the question of moderate Muslims, you know, I think more of them do need to speak up. Of course, even saying that is now considered Islamophobic, and I'm not even joking. If you say after a terrorist attack or after a radical Islamist does something, if you say, look, we need more Muslim voices really to stand with us against this kind of thing, that's seen as Islamophobic. Now, it's so difficult to have these discussions. It's so difficult to work these things out because of the culture of censorship and the culture of cowardice. You know, in relation to synagogues versus mosques, I just think I'm really worried about what's happening in some mosques. I don't mean all mosques by any stretch of the imagination, but some of them. And, you know, in reference to an earlier point someone made about two-tier justice or two-tier policing, you know, we've seen people put in jail for saying burn down the mosque, which I think, by the way, is an awful thing to say. But then there hasn't been the same response to imams inside certain mosques who said maybe we should kill Jews. Let's attack the Jews. So that double standard that's coming from the establishment down is really deeply concerning. And I think unless we get a handle on some of these radical sentiments that do exist in some mosques, then we're going to have a real problem. But I think in terms of winning over more allies, I really do think it is about taking as much action and speaking as publicly as much as one can in order to win people to our side, and making it clear to them that there are arenas in which they can meet people like us and meet other like-minded souls. You know, that might be at one of the counter protests, it might be in a discussion like this, it might be at some small public meeting in a local town or a local village, indicating to people that there are physical arenas in which they can gather with other people who think Israelophobia is nuts and has gone off the rails. I think that's probably a good start, because as well as the silent majority, I think there are probably some angry people out there who don't know where or how to express that anger. And I think tapping into that groundswell of concern for what's happening is really important too.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Joe Silver, you'll be the last question. And my apologies to Felix, Benjamin and Sammy that We ran out of time. Joe.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Brendan. I'll try and keep this short, but something that I believe is quite sinister and hasn't been mentioned at all with all the problems that we're going through is, you mentioned, Brendan, with reference to Columbia University and the atrocious behaviour that the university allowed to happen to the students for well over a year. Now, this isn't something that it's hearsay. I have a copy of the JC in front of me because I've been very worried about this for some time. And that is that after a year, the Manouchi Shafik, who was the president, she has now resigned. And guess what? She flees to the United Kingdom to become, to take up a job in the Foreign Office, the UK Foreign Office. This is the same woman, the same Columbia president. What the hell is she doing in the UK Foreign Office? Is this not the enemy within? What is happening? We've only been talking about the surface tonight. What's underground? What's really keeping this anti-Semitism rolling, in your opinion?
I think one of the problems we face is the moral double standards in the ruling section of society. I mean, it really is extraordinary. They will turn a blind eye to bigoted ideas or prejudiced behavior that comes from one community while clamping down on the same behavior if it comes from a different community. And I think often people with Islamist views or Israelophobic views or views that we would consider problematic are given an easier ride than people with other kinds of views. So that's a substantial problem, which is one of the reasons why we have to tackle the accusation of Islamophobia in order to grant greater freedom of speech. I actually think there is such a thing as anti-Muslim bigotry, and I think it's a growing problem in Europe. But I think Islamophobia is a different kettle of fish entirely, because that's a censorious idea. That's an idea that's designed to control how we think and how we speak and how we engage with ideas like this. But I think one of the impacts of the nonsense idea of Islamophobia, which is really a form of blasphemous censorship, is that it is difficult to call out these influences in the government, in the media, in the activist class, because if you do, you're accused of Islamophobia. Why are you bullying this person? Why are you raising concerns about that person? So again and again, I come back to the necessity of breaking down any barrier to having an open, frank discussion about these problems. And I know that sounds like maybe a trivial starting point, but it really is the starting point, that in order to dig into the rather profound corruption of our own government and our own civil service and our own establishment by these ideas, we're going to need as much freedom and frankness as we can muster. And I think that's got to be the real starting point.
But we're not actually getting that, are we? When you get part of our government, it's absolutely out of the question that you have somebody that has been running the Columbia University with all the anti-Semitism that's taken place, and we give her a job in the Foreign Office. Outrageous.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you thank all the questions ever so much. And once again, my apologies to those that hasn't been time to ask. I just want to say there'll probably be at least 2, possibly 3 further NGA events this year. Possibly one of them will be in person and 1 or 2 of them will be on Zoom. I want to remind you once again that the next NGA trip to Israel begins on Sunday, the 26th of January. And those of you who'd like to come or haven't been on one of the previous trips, please contact the office. Now it's my great pleasure to ask Heath Sloan, our press officer, to propose the vote of thanks. Heath.
Well, good evening. Thank you so much, Brendan and Jonathan, for your excellent discussion this evening. I think it's given us a lot to go away and think about with all these insightful and probing topics and questions, which I think all too often aren't given the kind of nuance and depth of discussion that we heard tonight from both of you. A few things that really stuck out to me that I want to reflect on. Brendan, you said that even the Jews' historical experience of victimization is being stolen from us by the activist class. And I think that really gets to quite the crux of this civilizational shift we're experiencing. And Jonathan, your point about the silent majority, and how do we make them louder, and the megaphones of society being wielded by people who are not exactly in our corner. But also the conceptual and pragmatic issues and suggestions that you came with this evening about how we can push back on this civilizational clash, I think give us a lot of cause for further concern, but also ideas that we can certainly pick up and run with. I'd like to thank the audience as well for attending this evening and giving up their night, and to keep abreast of all the NGA's upcoming events by subscribing to our newsletter, as well as visiting the NGA website. We look forward to hosting Brendan and Jonathan in future events as well. Good evening.
Good evening. A final point. Those of you who are not members, please join. It is £18 for life, not an annual subscription, £18 for life. And if you're under the age of 30, it's only £5, because we are eventually going to start only having members at events, because at the moment, not all of you are members. So please, please, please do join. It just remains for me to wish you a wonderful remainder of the evening. Thank you for joining us. Good night.